Hello and welcome everyone to Integration Down Under October 2025 meeting. The organizers for Integration Down Under are Martin, Dan, Mick, Wagner, and myself. And tonight we have Mike Stephenson. I always call him Michael, but that's all right. He gave me the thing with Mike. Talking about Logic App unit testing. And I'm very interested in this one too, because I've been trying to set some unit tests up. And I also have come up with an interesting use case for just the basic unit test. And this will be an interesting one to give Mike. Because one of the things I always have problems with the Logic App standards is if you make a edit to it and it's wrong and you don't do a local test, you deploy it and you can't find it because it basically had an error, but it doesn't tell you that anywhere in there. But if I can run the unit tests, now it'll do that that build, the same one it does for the local when you do a local debug, and that'll fail in your pipeline. So you won't deploy anything that's broken.
That's interesting. Yeah, really good.
So that's going to be an interesting use case for me because I have several times deployed things. Why is it working? I can't get it to start. And then I go back and look and I've misspelled a variable or something like that. And it's basically just not deployed the new Logic App. So this will be a good one. So let me just hand over to Mike now and you can get started.
Perfect. So I think you've got my screen share already, Bill, haven't you?
Yes.
It's great to meet everybody. So today we're going to talk about exactly what Bill said. I've just done this session at Nordic Summit on Tuesday. So you guys are really lucky. Everything I did wrong on Tuesday, I now know how to fix and do this session in a much more polished way. And so thanks, guys, for having me. Early morning here, so I'm not a morning person usually. So if I'm looking rough, please give me a free pass on that one. We're going to talk about Logic App unit testing today. Now, for those, I'm sure I know most of you guys already. Anyone who doesn't know me, Mike Stephenson. I talk about integration, architecture, FinOps is one of my kind of things I'm quite into as well. So if you see some of the content I do nowadays, I talk quite a lot about cost management and how to optimize your resources to make sure you don't spend too much money. I also, personally, I really like talking about golf and football and that kind of thing. So if ever you bump into me at a conference and come and tell me about the great shot you hit on the golf course at the weekend, you'll have my attention for hours. So let's jump in. So this whole testing thing for Logic Apps has been a kind of a, I guess, like one of my pet projects for quite a long time. It's something I've talked a lot about when I was day-to-day building Logic Apps for customers. It's a hard problem, there's different kinds of testing. Integration's hard by nature, so testing it's hard. I think the key thing with the testing is that there's multiple different types of testing. So I want to kind of really zone in on what we actually are talking about today. So for me, there's, I've kind of put this little pyramid diagram together to show a bit of what I think it looks like. So really today we're talking about the bit at the bottom, which is unit testing. So what does that actually mean? So what we're going to do is in the unit test framework that Wagner's published from the product team, we're going to test a workflow. So that's what we call our testable unit. And that means we're going to, in Bill's case, before things like the compilation of a workflow, the flow through the workflow, and we're really going to host that workflow locally, either on your dev machine or in a build agent, and test, does the workflow do what we expect it to do? Now, the key thing to understand the difference between integration testing and unit testing is unit testing is all about the workflow itself. Integration testing is more about the deployment of the workflow, the configuration and the connectivity to other systems. So if you're familiar with the testing space in automation for a while, you'll know that there's already an online framework that I built a few years ago that quite a lot of people use for testing logic apps as well. So we really need to understand the difference between those two approaches. So really, if you use the open source framework I did, what you're doing is you're testing the workflow once it's deployed into Azure, once it's got the API connections there, it's got all your configuration, and basically you ping a message to your workflow in Azure, you let it do its thing, and then you test the run history to see, did it call into SAP, did it save a message in CRM, and that kind of thing. The key difference with the unit testing is because we're running it locally, it doesn't actually connect to the end systems. You're going to mock out all of those dependencies, which is one of the things we look at today. So there's, for me, the important bit is you really want to do both of these types of testing to get the solution you're really looking for. And note that they do different things. So for me, as we go through, hopefully I'll touch on some of the points where with the integration testing, there's a few kind of pros and cons, and there's a few constraints you have with that the unit testing kind of fills the gap. So for me, if we think like .NET developers, the thing we'll do is we'll unit test our workflows first, and then we'll integration test them when we've done that. So really, Bill, for your specific question you just asked before, I think that's a really great use case where you can do a basic unit test of your workflow and know that it compiles and is correct and it should deploy fine. Dead easy to do that. Do that first, and then when you deploy it, do integration testing. Now, the end-to-end testing, that's where I've also done some content or using Playwright. So a good example would be here, I might do some automation where so let's imagine I use Playwright to automate the UI of an application, fill in a form, submit the form. Then I can use the integration testing framework to go and check, did the logic app run? And then I may use the Playwright to automate an application at the end to test, did the right things get set up in the UI of that target application. So there's videos, I'll touch on where these are later, but I've done some videos about how to do that. And I think for me, that's probably more in the UAT arena that you're going to do that automated end-to-end testing. But know that there's different types of testing, and there's a little link there for Integration Playbook where you can learn more about these. Okay, so let's come on to unit testing now. So there's a couple of frustrations about unit testing that people in the community have really complained about for a number of years. So one's I need to run my tests locally has always been a bit of a pain. How can I mock dependencies? So my workflow sends a message to Cosmos DB and Database. How do I mock those dependencies so that when I'm kind of running my tests locally, I don't care that Database is offline or something like that? That's something you really need to do in a unit test. How can I run my tests in a pipeline, and how can I integrate the tests in Azure DevOps? So there's some of the challenges that we're going to talk about today. We're going to have a look at how we can deal with those. Now, we want to have like a test solution that we can look at while if we keep this in the back of our minds while we go through today's session. So here we're going to submit a message, and we're going to have the first logic app workflow. The order processor is going to pick the message up. We're then going to pass it to a decision maker who's going to use Azure OpenAI to help decide, is this order from a VIP or not? And then that OpenAI model is going to have access to some tools to help it make the decision. So we've got things like get customer history, get customer value. The AI and the decision maker is going to return back an indicator if it's a VIP order or not. And then if it's a VIP, we're going to save it in Cosmos DB. And if it's not a VIP, we'll save it in storage account. So we keep this bigger picture in the back of our mind as we go through these demos. And we'll really talk about some of the ways we'll test these different bits and build up the solution. I'm sorry, just bear with me 1 second, guys. I'm also going to just open my little pen app here so I can draw on the screen while we go through the next bits. So we're going to start off with some basics about how we're going to do the absolute bare minimum of these kind of tests. So here I'm going to go into my VS Code, and I'm going to show you this sample solution that we can have a look at. So in the I'll just open this a second. So in VS Code here, I've got this kind of solution up here, and I'm going to put this solution in GitHub because I really want to have everybody able to go and have a look at this solution, have a look through the code, see some of these techniques in action, and then look at replicating them in your environment. So you'll notice here that the projects I've got in this workspace, we've got the logic app here, which is a typical logic app solution. I've got this logic app functions. So here we've got some inline functions, and I'll have a look at how I might use them, how I might test them. In the scope of today's session, I'm not going to really look at the unit testing of the functions themselves, but I have got samples in here that show you how you can test them. And there's a video that goes through that in more detail that you guys will be able to look at offline. There's a folder with some tests I'm going to talk about a bit more in a minute. And then in the deployment folder, I've got things like bicep scripts, and I've got all the YAML pipelines that, again, everybody will be able to look at after this session. So in the test folder, we have a quick look in here. You'll see there's a couple of bits. So the acceptance tests folder is that's going to be a folder that has the integration tests in using the open source framework. So what I want to be able to do with that is I want to be able to look at do a deployment of my app from VS Code into my dev Azure resource group, and then run those tests and check, did it all work after I've deployed it? So they can be part of the same solution here. The logic app folder is where the generated tests and the written tests I'll do that are really the unit tests. That's what we're going to focus on today, is that logic app folder, to see how we do the unit testing. But for me, having the big picture of both sets of tests together really gives me this full end-to-end solution. And we'll see when we look at the pipelines later on, you'll see there's different stages for that. Now, what we're going to do first is if we take a look at the logic app folder up here. So we'll start off with Hello World, and I'll start by opening the designer, and we'll cross my fingers now that it opens up. So we'll give that a second. Right, so here's my logic app designer. Just a really vanilla workflow. So the first question we have is, how do we get started with creating a unit test? And there's really two ways you can do this, depending on what your preference is. So the first option is I can go create unit test. So this is a huge big thumbs up to Wagner, because a lot of people, it's difficult to get started. So we want to make this really easy and make there be no excuses for not doing this. So I can click this button here, go through a very small wizard, and generate a unit test. Now, there is another way that I can do this. So if we open up the run history here, I want to compile that first as well, check it's running. So we just give this a second to load up here. So you can see I've got one previous run. And if we go into the run history, you'll see there's also a button up here called Create Unit Test from Run. Now, out of these two choices, this one's really my preferred one, because there is going to be a subtle difference. In the case of a really simple workflow, it doesn't really matter. But in more complex workflow, I can get a better test, because we can use the run history here. And if I go click Unit Test from Run, so we need to give this a name. So we'll call it Down Under, and that's going to go and generate some code for me from this run. Now, what we'll do, if we go down to the tests here, so you'll notice under the Logic App folder, it creates a folder for each workflow here. So if we go into our Hello World, you can see we've got a folder called Down Under. So under here, you'll basically get a different folder for each test that you generate. So we'll go in and have a look at some code here. So really, if you notice, there's two files here that have been created. One of them is a JSON file, and the other one's a C# class. So that's going to have the things like the test class decorators for MS Test on them. Now, in the JSON file, what we've really got here is it's used that run history to create mock messages. So you'll see, I had this request action where we receive an HTTP request. So it's got the headers and it would have the body in here if there was a body. And then if you remember, I had that function call. So it's got a JSON message here where we call this function, and that's the body that would come back from the function call. So really, if you think what we're doing here, when we run this test, we're not actually really calling the function. We're going to mock it, so it'll return a response from the unit test framework. And really, this lets us zone in on just the workflow. Now, if we go and have a look at the test here, now one of the things maybe that I think people might find it slightly challenging to begin with is it does actually generate quite a bit of code here. So if we look at the top, we've got this class, we've got test initialization, which is really about setting up the test framework. We then have a couple of operations. So the first one's going to be just a really basic test here. And if we look at this bit here, we follow this idea of kind of arrange, act, assert, which is like a fairly standard kind of three-step approach for unit testing. So this bit at the top, where we prepare the mocks, in this case, what we're doing is it really loads that JSON file, and then we have like a pre-prepared set of data under the hood in the test framework that we'll then use to drive the workflow. We then do the act stage here, where this basically runs the workflow. So it'll take your JSON file in the proper Logic test project, load it up into the test executor, and it'll run it. And then down the bottom here is where we'll assert what happened. Now, the assertions that it'll do out the box are quite basic. So it's really going to just test, did it run, and give you a success or not. You can extend this with your own assertions later on. Now, we'll just take a little bit of a look further down. So here you'll see where it's done other kinds of example tests. So if you notice, the key bit here is the arrange is slightly different. So what this is doing is, rather than loading the JSON file, it's actually letting you build the mocks in code yourself, which I'm going to come on to a bit more later on. But this really lets you start going to much more advanced scenarios. Okay, and then there'll be another test further down again where it gives you a failure example. Now, what I tend to find in practice is I usually start by deleting sample 2 and 3 and just start with sample 1 and then build it out myself from there. But really, if you think of that scenario of getting up and running is really what we're looking to do quickly. So, Bill, think of your scenario here, right? You built that workflow, you one-click generate your test, and then you're going to go to the test explorer over here, and we should be able, if you see, I've got my 3 projects. So we've got my function tests, my acceptance tests, and if I go into my my unit tests here, we've got a build error, right? So I'll skip this bit for a second. So if we go into Hello World, this is where I would expect this, if this compiled, which I'm not going to waste time troubleshooting it today, but when this compiles, I'll immediately see my new test here, and I'll be able to run it straight away. And the idea being, your basic test build for your question about how do I make sure that these workflows compile, if that test fails, then the JSON couldn't be loaded by the runtime, and that should catch your variable / parameter issue. It's not going to catch something like if the configuration of the Logic app was wrong, that stopped you being able to run it because maybe you haven't set a variable in the app settings that feeds through a variable or something like that. That wouldn't be caught. That's an integration test problem, but the workflow JSON being correct would definitely be caught by this.
Yeah, and that's what I was trying to get the thing to do, because basically, if I forget to just run a quick start debugging, because what that'll do is it throws up those configuration errors that I've renamed a variable and it's missing or something like that. That's the kind of things that I want to catch, and if I can catch that in a test step in my build, then I know that I won't deploy something that's bad.
Yeah, so you 100% should catch that with this. That'd be really cool. Now, one of the things that I think's come a long way since I first started using Logic App testing is things like C# Dev Kit really help in VS Code. For a long time, I wasn't really a huge fan of VS Code for development because it was just never quite as simple as Visual Studio from a tooling perspective. So there used to be like an open source thing that you would use as a test explorer, but actually with C# Dev Kit, you now have a very similar to Visual Studio experience. This test explorer is pretty easy to use. You've got all of the kind of this stuff like you would get in Visual Studio, so you can run tests, debug a test, and that kind of thing. And I think, you know, one of the really good ones, if we take a look at one of them Hello World tests here, so I've just deleted that one I just generated, assuming it has the error, but I should be able to just put a breakpoint in here, go to my test, debug it, and, you know, fingers crossed we'll just jump in and hit that breakpoint, and then I could just kind of step through here. So that there I'm stepping through, setting up my mocks. Here I'm going to run my workflow. Should take a second or two, and then we should be able to do these assertions down at the bottom. So really, this assertion here, Bill, is probably the minimum you need that did my workflow succeed. So if you hover over the status here, you can see it succeeded. Now, what I'll do at this point, I'll just kind of give you a few sort of gotchas and a couple of things to watch out for. So the first one is when you run these tests, the important thing to remember is it's not really running in the Logic App runtime that you normally would. You know, if I do right click, get it up and running, get the URL, stick it in Postman and run it, that's different to what this is here in a subtle way. So what will happen in the Postman example is it's going to create a run, it's going to log it in my run history, and then when I right click on my workflow over here, I'll see that run history we were looking at before, and I'll be able to step through it. Now in the unit test framework, because everything gets mocked by the runtime, it gets mocked by the test executor, you don't actually interact with storage and you don't interact with the target systems. So you won't have a run history to be able to visually go and look at. Now, I've had a bit of a chat with Wagner about whether that'll be something that they'll ever kind of support, because you know, that troubleshooting bit's kind of really helpful. But in the unit test framework, you'll have access to the run history of the workflow as a JSON object that you can interact with, that we'll look at in a minute. But really, you won't have this visualization yet because there wasn't really a run. It was all mocked. So that's one of the key gotchas to be aware of.
Hey, Mike, and a quick question. What happens if you have one workflow calling another workflow? Does it call that second workflow, or does it mock that second workflow?
No, you'd mock it. I'm going to come on to that actually in a minute, Bill, a little bit when we look at the next example. But really, every shape in the workflow. So if we have a look, let's have a look. This one's open. So the function call gets mocked. Things like a parse JSON or compose shape, variable shapes, they don't get mocked, but anything that calls outside of your workflow is going to get mocked. So I think things like API connectors, built-in connectors, I think things like if you called an integration account, that would get mocked as well. But anything kind of like inline itself in the workflow would just execute as normal. Okay, so we'll take a look at, hopefully that's a good example of the basics. So we're going to dig deeper now. We're going to talk about agents because I think this is really an interesting topic area. So as we talk about agents, we're going to introduce some more complex scenarios as well, because I think this gets like into the weeds quite quickly. So one of the challenges with an agent is we have deterministic workflows that we're all used to, but when we build agents, we have non-deterministic workflows. And the problem we have here is, let's say I have a workflow and I give it input A and I get output B. And every single time I run that, if I put input A in, I always get input B out. So from a testing perspective, that's really easy because we can make huge assumptions about that. But when we build an agent, we have a non-deterministic workflow that has the objective of achieving a goal. And how it achieves the goal gets influenced by the model. So I might put input A in, but I don't have a guarantee I'm going to get input B out. I might get input C sometimes, and that might depend on a number of different things. So it could be the case, a good example would be, I might look up an order history, and the model might determine that actually the value of the customer has gone up very slightly, and it might decide there's a reason why you're now a VIP that isn't 100. It's not like a rule engine where if this, then that. It's making it like a bit more like a human. It's thinking through, does this look like a VIP or not? And it may decide that you are in cases that you haven't made it an explicit assumption from. So that's really just understand the difference between deterministic and non-deterministic, but that's going to influence our testing quite significantly. So there's a couple of things here now. If I think I'm going to actually bring my slide back up a second here, because I think this key bit here, architecture-wise, the first thing. So one of the things that I've done in an agent loop is I think it's really important how you build these, because what was quite interesting at the Nordic Summit is Kent showed this slide, which is a great example where he had the agent loop and he had all these different shapes in the agent loop. So if we take a look here at my agent loop example in the designer, so what he displayed on the board was an agent loop, and it had, let's say we had 10 different tools here, and each tool had, some of them had query something from SharePoint, then do something, and the other ones had query something from ServiceNow, and then do something. And each of these shapes each of these tools was quite complicated in what it did. But then he had one that looks like this, where it calls a child workflow. And I think that's a really important pattern here, because your agent's going to get complicated really quickly, and the more stuff you have in it, the harder it is to test. And if you think how hard it would be to test all of these different shapes in to make sure they all work, is going to be quite challenging. So what I'm looking to do here is, I think if we follow this pattern where every tool calls a child workflow, right, what I can do is then I can encapsulate that complexity. So I can do a unit test for my get customer history, and I can do one for my get customer value, which we'll see down here. You'll see these two folders test those workflows on their own. So I can make sure they're really robust, do exactly what I want before I use them in my agent. So this is the real key benefit here. If you think we're think of layering this up like a pyramid, so we're making sure all the foundation building blocks work before the agent uses them. The benefit of this, I think, as well, is when you build multiple agents, these tools become reusable. So you're not configuring the same stuff in each agent. It's really handy as well. But I would start by unit testing these. Then I've got my agent here. So I've got, things like my system instructions down here. I've told it about my agents. I've told it down here I'm returning a JSON, whether you're a VIP or not, and a justification of your decision. And then what I'm going to do after that is, if you see in my my order processor workflow here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to basically get the input request message, and then I'm going to call my agent child workflow here. And that's basically going to go and call out to my model, execute my tools. And then if we flow down a bit here, you'll see we then have this decision point about was it a VIP or not. From a test perspective, if you think how I've made these be testable, is this starts making my tests much easier, because instead of having one massive test doing absolutely everything that I'll guarantee to break all the time, I've now got multiple smaller tests. So I test my tools, they're good. I test my decision maker, that's good. And because I can mock the tools, and I'll show you how to do this in a minute, I can influence what the model's going to do. And then in this this processor, what I would do is I would mock out the call to the child workflow, so I don't actually need to care about any of the AI stuff when I test the process. All I do is I return a mock that says VIP true or false, and then I can test, did it go down this route or did it go down this route here? So we'll have a look in the next few minutes. We'll have a look at a few tests that cover these scenarios, but hopefully it comes across that by breaking this up, I can really make it much more efficient to build these tests. And I think if we take an analogy I always use with unit testing, I think it's a good way to think about it. So my dad, I always remember as a kid, my dad used to be a bricklayer and a fireman, and I used to watch him build a brick wall, and he'd put every brick he'd put on top of the other bricks, had the cement on it, and then he'd always tap a brick to get it nice and firmly in place so it wasn't loose and it wasn't misplaced. And every single brick got tapped multiple times. And then when he got to the end, he had a nice, sturdy, well-built wall. And each of those taps is really a unit test, making sure those bricks are properly in place. What he didn't do is he didn't build the entire wall, get to the end, and then try and test it and go, oh, the bricks are all misaligned and not quite in the right place, and he's now in a really bad position that his wall looks terrible and is going to fall over. And I think that's how I try to always think in the back of my mind when I'm building these tests. Okay, so let's start. We'll have a look at the testing for the decision maker, which is this folder down here. Now, this test gets a bit more complicated, and you'll notice there's a mock JSON file, and there's also a text file here. So one of the things I've done is I'm going to show you how to return a mock response from a file, and also how to build your own mock response in code. So we'll have a look at a couple of these tests now. So if we go back up to the top of the file, and we'll just walk through what this is doing. So at the top here, we set up the test executor, and we're going to start at this method here. So I've got a high value customer who should be a VIP. So you can see here I've set some variables, with the key one being that indicates the customer value is 99. He's going to be a VIP. Now, what I want to do next is kind of set up my mocks. So you'll notice in this prepare stage here, I'm actually building the mock for the action get customer history. So if you remember in the designer for the agent, which I think's over here, we've got these two child workflows. So what I'm really doing here is I'm saying we create the mock, and we're going to set the code here for what it should do when we execute this. So here we're going to actually return some data back to the workflow runtime. So what I'm really doing is I'm reading this customer sample message, which is over here, and that's going to return that data back to the runtime when the mock executes, and we'll be able to kind of influence what that's going to do. Now, if I go a bit further down, I've also got another mock, and here you can see I'm actually doing the get customer value mock, and here I just create a JSON object on the fly, and we return that. So I'm just gonna put a couple of breakpoints in here inside these, so we can have a little bit of a step through this in a minute. And then really what I'm going to do after that is here we'll act. So we're going to trigger the runtime, start the workflow off and execute it. And then from here down, we're going to create a bunch of assertions. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to just execute this test and we'll just go through these breakpoints, I think. So we go order decision maker, should be a VIP, and we'll debug the test. Okay, so you can see we've jumped into our breakpoint here. So I need one here as well. So here we're going to set up my mock, and here we set my second mock up. And now we're going to run the runtime. So this is going to execute the test. So the workflow is going to run now. And what we're going to see is, if you notice here, the next breakpoint is kind of, we were down here, it's jumped back up to my mock code. So what happened here, there's a couple of really important bits. So number one, the first important bit is, while I can mock all these different connectors, there's one bit the team haven't built the ability to mock right now, which is the actual call to the LLM model. Now, I think that's something Wagner's saying the team are like working on, and it may come down the line, but it's actually quite a hard problem to solve that one in some ways, because what the model's doing is, it isn't just doing a request response to get data, it's actually executing an orchestration. And if anybody knows how the models work with tools behind the scenes, it's actually kind of calling back to my workflow and then back to the model in kind of a loop. So that might be quite challenging for them to do. So, but at the minute, just be aware here, I did actually call the model, and the model called back to my workflow to execute the tool. The next thing is, I did set a variable here, so I know this tool got executed. And you can see actually the model's basically called back to both of my tools. And here I'm returning my responses. So the model then got that data from those two tools, finished its execution, and I've now got my kind of test run here. So this test run object is really your run history. So you can see I've got all my actions in here that got called, and I've got a whole bunch of other data available. So I can now start making the assertions about what happened. So if we step through a few of these, we can see the first assertion was that my my workflow succeeded, which was good. I now need to get my run history. Now, this is one of the kind of challenges with the agent loop as well. So here, what I can do is I can say test run.actions, give it the name of the action, and then I get the kind of action itself here. So you'll see where I've got the agent loop, I've just said, did the agent loop succeed? So this is really a bit like the original open source framework. We're just going through all the actions and say, did they skip, did they succeed, etc. I can even do things like get the message body for the input and the output, and I can interact with them, which I'll show in the YouTube videos I've got that people can look at offline. But I can say, the agent was successful. I can check the response object. So here I'm looking at the response action, and I say that was successful. The one bit, that second point I was saying, the two issues with the agent test, and the second thing I can't do is in the run history right now, I can't get the tool execution. So if you remember in the Logic App run history, you can see the nice pretty chat message that you can interact with visually, which is brilliant. But when a unit test's done, the way they store that in the JSON's not the same as they do for other actions. So I haven't quite worked out yet how to get those chat history to go through it. So what I did to work around that problem is, if you remember in the mock earlier, when we executed the mock, I saved a variable, and I could also save the message body potentially here that came into the mock, and then I can make assertions down here. So what I really wanted to check was, say, did both of my tools execute, is really what I'm doing down here. So saving that variable is an easy way for me to do that. And then down here, I get the response body. So if you see response output, which comes from the response shape, So you'll see we've got this JSON object I can interact with. So you can see kind of here, it's got the is VIP, etc. So I can just go and grab that is VIP value. So we should have true here, and then I can just assert yes, this person should be a VIP. And then if we go back to my tests over here, you'll get that green test. Now, one of the little gotcha for agent testing is error conditions. So I've left this as a test that always fails as a reminder to myself. But if I go into my test scenarios, that you'll see there's one here where it should fail. And what I've actually done, if you kind of look at this mock here, when we execute the mock, I've set the response to be an action that failed. And I can give it an arbitrary response value here. The problem I have is, even though that action fails, that mocked out child workflow call, in my deterministic logic app, that would then make the workflow fail. But with the agent, that's not really how it works behind the scenes. So what would happen is the agent would get an error back, but the agent will just handle it and swallow it up. So what it would say in my case was, is this a VIP customer? It would call the two tools. One of them may give a response back and the other may give an error. And the agent will the LLM will basically go, I didn't get any data from that, so I'll just ignore it and I'll make my decision based on the other bit. Now, I have a feeling what I could probably do is give the system instructions information about what to do if any of these get errors, and then probably influence, maybe put like an is error flag in the response and make this more mature. But right now it'll just give me back is it a VIP or not, and work out how it determined that based on a subset of the data rather than all of it. So in my case, what I expected to do in my assertions kind of further down is so I expect it to do this assertion here and say the workflow failed, but it doesn't actually fail because the LLM kind of just swallows the error up and compensates for it. Okay, so hopefully, I know that's quite complicated, but I wanted to really deep dive and show a couple of different scenarios, but let's just chuck an agent in because that's what everybody's building, and we're thinking ahead about how to test those agents, which is good. Now, we're next going to look at pipelines, and we'll have a look at how we integrate this into DevOps. So here in my deployment, there's a couple of things. So number one, if you want to look at the bicep about how I build my sample app, that's going to be in here. People can look at that offline. We also have pipelines. So I've got this main pipeline here, which is a multi-stage pipeline. And in the templates, I've got two different places the tests can happen. So in the acceptance tests, you'll see that this is the one where it deploys the logic app and goes and tests them. So this is where you want to look if you want to look at how I do that. But for the context of today's session, we're really looking at this build.yaml here. And where we're going is really down the bottom. And if you imagine I'm going to show you the DevOps pipeline and visually in a few minutes, so just kind of bear with me if you're not as familiar with YAML. But I want to talk about a few of these key steps. So here, we've got the bit where we use the out-of-the-box Microsoft build task. So this will basically point to our logic app folder and zip it all up ready for deployment. Here, I'm going to publish that deployment package as a package I can use later in my multi-stage pipeline to deploy the logic app. But then a little bit further down, we use the out-of-the-box .NET CLI test steps here. So running the logic app unit tests is basically a case of point to the folder the logic app tests are in. We do a .NET test command with the .NET CLI. You might put these log app parameters in just to make it nice and visual on the test step, but this really runs our unit tests in exactly the same way we'd run them for .NET, which is a big thumbs up because we want these skills to be transferable. I also have my function tests down here as well. so I can run both of them side by side and make sure those unit tests are all good. Now, if we now go to Azure DevOps, we'll have a look at my project here. Second, load up, and I've got my multi-stage pipeline. So we'll have a look at this one that's been running. And here you'll see I've got 4 stages. So my first stage is build, unit test, and package. So this doesn't deploy anything to Azure. It's just this preparation where we'll get our code, we'll compile it, we'll unit test it, and we'll create a deployable package that can be deployed to my other environments. So in here, what I'm basically doing, I'll see if I can stretch that somehow. It's not liking it. Let me zoom out a bit. So you can see here in my build, run unit test and package, there's a few steps that I go through. So I've put little emojis on to make these easy to see what they're doing. So anything where there's a magnifying glass is really just like inspecting for diagnostics. Anything with a tools build, you can see anything with a little funny little, I guess it's a syringe or something, is a test. So what we're doing is we'll install .NET 8. So one of the key things that out of the box, Microsoft, if you generate a pipeline, it'll really just do this task here, where it'll build your logic app, which is for me, that's hello world. To do a real pipeline, we need all the other stuff. And to do the unit testing, we need .NET 8, we need to compile the solution, we need Azure installed, so that's not always installed on your build agent, so we set that up and we start it. We install func.exe if it's not already there. I quite like to test just to make sure I know what version I've got, because if I have a problem, sometimes it might be a version thing. So this is the build task that the product team give us. So it packages everything up and then we publish it. And then here you'll see I actually run my tests. So you can see we've got one failed. That's the error one for the AI agent, which I deliberately make fail. So I've got this set to run on continue on error. But you'll see I've got all my tests that passed and succeeded and failed and got errors. And I've got like logging in here that'll tell me what's been going on if there's a problem. So that if you imagine this runs through, my tests are all good, I'm happy with them. I can then go to my approvals for deployment to dev. So I make this one auto approve. The other environments I have to manually click to approve them. And then here, this is where I'm doing the actual parameterization and deployment of the logic app. So this starts coming into the unit testing. So down here, when I run my acceptance tests here, this is actually testing the deployed logic app. And I do that for dev, test, and production. After we do the deployment of the logic app, we'll go and test them with a bunch of tests. But in this pipeline stage right at the top, this is where we're just testing those unit tests on the workflow. So Bill, coming back to your original question, this would be where you can have those kind of verification tests that you can run locally before you check in, which I think is even better than what you were looking for in the build pipeline. But actually, as a backstop to catch other developers breaking your logic app, if you run these in the build agent, then before you even start deploying, you can make sure everybody that's checked in, all those logic apps can all be at least bare minimum, have their tap on the brick to make sure they compile and they should work when you deploy them. And I think that solves your problem.
Yep, I think so.
The other good thing, actually, because the product team are leveraging all the out-of-the-box features, so in addition to plugging this into our normal pipelines, we also get the test runs. They'll automatically publish, so you can see here, I've got a bunch of, I've got my logic app unit tests, function unit tests, and then when I do deployments to different environments, I've got some deployment verification tests. So those unit tests we were running, I can click on this. I can see a summary here. I can see all the individual tests that ran, and I can, go into them, and you can get access to like log messages and stuff like that. So it's a nice, decent experience that hopefully will be really good for everybody. Okay, so I know we've not got long left, so I'll start wrapping up now. So I've got this little slide in for when I did this at Nordic Summit. There was a couple of things I wanted to show people that I've kind of forgot to. Now, I think I've covered everything today on my little checklist, so I think we're good. So really the key point I want to get to at the end is if you're a .NET developer, you're very used to trying to be absolutely perfect with your unit testing. I think that's quite hard to do with logic apps because whether you're doing integration testing, unit testing, etc., there's so many edge cases, it gets quite difficult quite quickly. So what I always say to people is, right, we don't have to be 100% perfect. If we focus on reducing our risk, that's the key thing. So, again, referencing back to your question, Bill, if I can make, with very little effort, I can make all those problems go away where your logic app gets deployed and it wasn't configured correctly because there was a problem. That saves you loads of time. Just by taking that extra 5 minutes to put a basic test in, you can save yourself hours of troubleshooting later. But it can go beyond that. You can test all those edge cases in the unit testing where you can force error conditions that are really difficult to force in the real world. If we can get our testing to be about 80% of perfect, that makes a massive reduction in risk of the likelihood of you having problems with your logic apps once you go to UAT. You start getting real users interacting with them through the integrations that they need, and then certainly that transitions into production. So reducing risk improves quality and it'll save you loads of time. Now, the last bit I want to touch on is where can I learn more? There's a couple of resources that I think are really important for people. So the first one is Integration Playbook. I'll ping these links to you, Bill, that you can share with people afterwards. So in here, we've got stuff about the different types of testing. You can click these links, and basically if you go into here, so this one, the unit testing one's all about today's stuff. So I've got things like some unboxing videos that show you how do I go from 0 to my first test. And then I've got all these how-to videos that go and, basically cover all the different things we've talked about today, but just going a bit deeper. So each of them has a video. Things like how do I deal with try catches, conditions. If you're interested in the integration tests for how to do stuff with a deployed logic app, there's a whole bunch of info about how to use the open source framework. Again, there's a whole load of videos here as well on different stuff. So hopefully everything you need's here. There's also on my YouTube channel, I've got 2 video playlists. So this one up here, Logic App Unit Testing, there's about a dozen videos. And then Logic App Standard Testing's ready, the integration testing framework. There's barely 20 videos there. So hopefully go and just dig into those, and hopefully it makes everybody's life a lot easier being able to do that testing. Bill, I think that's probably about everything covered. Let me know if you have any questions or if any of the guys have questions.
There hasn't been any questions so far, but let me just.
I'm sure there'll be questions once people start using it.
Yep.
So feel free to
basically, at the moment, there's not any, but again, we get a lot more people watching after the recording.
Yeah.
So people will ping with some questions and things like that. That's not a problem.
Perfect.
And no, but thank you very much. That covered a lot of the stuff that I was interested in. Can you get it to call those child workflows or not?
No. So the I think if I remember right, it's been a while since I did this, but I'm pretty sure it'll error out if you don't give it it's almost you have to give it a mock response because you're using the test execution engine, not the real runtime under the hood. So it doesn't actually deploy. Like if you imagine, it doesn't interact with storage is really what's happening under the hood. So if you think the way the Logic App runtime works, it pops a message on a queue that picks up by the runtime and executes the child workflow. That doesn't happen. So it really, you're just running it almost like an inline workflow in a way without actually talking about storage.
Yep. Okay, that's very good. So that will my challenge for tomorrow will be add some tests to one of my EDI workflows. See how we go.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you for having me, Bill.
Yep. Thank you for volunteering to get up early this morning and
Yeah, no problem.
join us. So thank you very much, and that will be it. Thanks everyone for listening in.